You're listening to Errol Parker and Clancy Overall, editors of the Batuta Advocate, on Desert Rock FM. Well, welcome back to the Batuta Advocate radio show, recording live here in Desert Rock FM studios in the Diamantina Shire. There's a lot going on in the world. Rishi Sunak has taken the reins as the British Prime Minister after a whopping 45 days from the predecessor Liz Truss. It was a very, very funny turn of events there where Boris Johnson nearly became Prime Minister again. He must have been offered a very plum posting to not put his hat in the ring, because he would have got it. It would have been very Kevin of them to do. Elsewhere in the world, Bolsonaro, is that how you say it, Wendell?
Close enough, yeah. Bolsonaro,
the Italian stallion that was the president of Brazil, pro-logging candidate, has lost his place to effectively the Brazilian Biden, Lulu, or whatever they call him, Lula.
So he's got dementia.
What?
Unfit for office.
Well, he's 77 years old and he's a career neoliberal left-wing politician. The only positive is that he...
So he's just the other guy.
The other guy who
the
is
best that
just
the other side
alive
could
enough
muster
to beat the populists.
Almost like what happened here.
Well, yes, and we're going to talk about that today. Australia's, this is a trend we're seeing around the world where all the big chest-beating leaders that kind of came in during the scary war on terror and all these Facebook elections that led us to these charismatic kind of leaders, from Trump to Boris to Bolsonaro to Duterte Harry in the Philippines and Scott Morrison here, they've all kind of filtered out now. I think the pandemic had a lot to do with that, people wanting a little bit of competency and a little bit of stability. But in Australia, it was a weird turn of events where literally... we used to call Morrison the Night Watchman because he came on as a surprise winner of that leadership spill that Dutton held against Turnbull. We used to call him the Night Watchman because we didn't think he'd last. He obviously won another election.
Yeah, he sure showed us, didn't he?
Yeah, he showed us. He did another term. But Albanese might be the real night... I wouldn't say Night Watchman, but I definitely at Bradbury. You look at Albanese a year ago to Albanese 6 months ago. The transformation was epic.
Tim Payne.
Pardon?
Dare I say, Tim Payne.
Tim Payne, yeah.
It's coming in after a bit of a saga, drama, just a cool head to lead the ship.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, just...
Good PR image.
Before a few of his own sagas.
Yes,
Yeah.
potentially.
But this month marks 6 months of Albanese, and we think it's time to kind of look back, assess what got him in, and look at what the first 6 months of his government looks like. And there's no better way to do this than to fill a room with 4 white men from Queensland. You've got, of course, myself, Clancy Overall. You've got Wendell Hussey. You've got Errol Parker, the pundits from the Batuta Advocate.
I'm white ethnic.
And
he's white ethnic.
I'm also white, but I'm from Hong Kong. So
yeah, so you
can make of that what you want.
I guess you're an expat, not an immigrant. But we do have one of Queensland's great social commentators, writers, and I guess you'd say political analysts, translators of the anxious and jumpy Queensland voters. Lech Blaine, thank you for joining us. Your third start on the Batuta Advocate podcast.
Thanks for having me, mate. I just got back from Queensland. It's beautiful up there.
Darling Downs, where were we talking?
Did a week in Brizzy, then went up to Toowoomba for the weekend, and so just catching up with family and friends, and a few delinquents and a few Broncos fans.
It's been out there in Queensland's unmowed lawn belt.
Yeah.
Unmowed lawn.
Yeah, unmowed lawn belt. Yeah, that makes sense.
Toowoomba's beautiful.
Toowoomba?
Yeah, it looks great.
Yeah, Poowoomba. Is it? Did they end up getting that desal plant or what?
No, but they ended up feeding the water through anyway, secretly, I believe.
Good on them. Now, Lech, we want to talk to you. You wrote an essay last time we had you in here. Sorry, we'll clarify. You just released your memoirs, Car Crash, and before that, we'd had you in talking about your essay for the Monthly on Peter V'landys during the pandemic and the NRL's great return to operations as the first football code in the world to get back on the ground, back on the pitch in the pandemic. You've since published a book. I know you're up in Queensland bouncing around working on your next book. We won't talk too much about that today because you're tied up with duct tape and NDAs and fucking embargoes and all that kind of stuff because, the second book's always the biggest. and we're expecting just as much success and another bestseller from you. But your essay we want to talk about today, Victory, it was titled. Where was that published?
Back in the Monthly.
In the Monthly?
Yeah.
First kind of full-length synopsis that we were able to read in the days after Albanese won government. How long did you spend on that one?
I would have spent really the election campaign and a little bit before it, but it was kind of the culmination of everything that I've been writing really since I started writing for the Monthly back in 2019, and so I sort of covered the electoral cycle, and from before the last election to just after this election. So I was pretty burnt out. Chuck in COVID, chuck in an addiction to oat chocolate milk. And I was...
And the collapse of the Brisbane Broncos.
And the collapse of the Brisbane Broncos. And I was really at the end of my tether. So it was quite an emotionally draining election campaign, but got back up to Queensland, went to the Hunter, went up to Billawheeler, and just tried to keep on doing what I'd been doing really since 2019, which is just getting a sense of how people felt maybe away from the daily news cycle that we saw on... national TV and national radio.
Now, I wanted to ask you about that, Lech. You spoke to so many different people from different parts of the country, all over the country, who come from different walks of life and have different jobs, lifestyles, all that sort of stuff. But I don't seem to see that a lot in traditional media, mainstream media maybe. Why do you think that is? Why do you think journalists are so scared to go and actually have conversations with people in places like Toowoomba or Bundaberg or Billawheeler or that sort of stuff? Why don't we see a lot of it until someone like you writes this big piece which talks to all of these different people?
I think you do see it. I think you see the sort of fly-in interviews and kind of vox pops with normal people, in inverted commas. But I think the beauty of what I'm allowed to do with the Monthly is that I kind of, and I don't really get compensated for how long I spend with people. And I don't do this deliberately, but I just rock up how I would rock up anywhere. Like, so I rock up in a pair of shorts and a T-shirt. And I talk to the people that I interview generally for at least an hour. So it's not really a vox pop. It's not, what do you think of Morrison? What do you think of Albanese? What do you think of Australian politics? Because generally I find that those are the least interesting responses. It's usually when you've been talking to someone for like 45 minutes or an hour, they will say something quite profound or interesting or kind of revealing about both their life and maybe the way that they view politics. And those two things are connected. And without that kind of biographical information or emotional core, I think that you end up just getting, really like a 10-second, 15-second grab of, I hate Scott Morrison or I hate Anthony Albanese.
Yeah. Those little grabs that you see on the news sometimes that don't really offer too much. So it's about the time spent talking to these people.
Yeah, and it's not like I'm doing anything particularly revolutionary. Like I think that the 24-hour news cycle probably can't accommodate that kind of length and depth, and that's just the way that it is. Like you can't do those kind of interviews with everyone. But yeah, I think the people that I talk to generally relax as well because, I've spent a lot of time around people who I don't necessarily have the same political opinions as, and I don't get upset or rant and rave or patronise people just because I've spent a fair bit of time in quite hairy situations. And so interviewing someone about politics it just comes naturally. It's just having a conversation with someone and trying to find out what makes them tick. It
is interesting you say that because those vox pops, those sound bites that you'll get on, Channel 7, Channel 9, even ABC, on the ground, they're not interesting, but they're also not that insightful because Queenslanders have this innate ability to either put themselves out there as a disruptor or put themselves out there as a conformist. They're either going to say, I'm in on ScoMo or I fucking hate ScoMo. They're going to say that off the bat. And then it takes, another bit of, massaging. And then you find out a lot of the people who say, I fucking hate ScoMo, actually they did feel a bit sorry for him. And then the people who love ScoMo, actually, you poke them for a little while and you find out that they think he's a moron. Yeah, Queenslanders, quite stoic in a sense where you kind of need to massage it. And I guess it's not so much the time, it's also the environment you're in, out front of the post office, not on the streets in front of the electoral ballot. Is that right?
And people don't want to feel like you're trying to make them look like a dickhead.
Yeah.
And so if you actually have a chat to them and kind of just, another thing that I do is I like, beyond not being dressed in a suit, because I can't remember the last time I wore a suit, but I tell people a bit about myself, and that's probably something that journalists generally don't. Like they don't. The journalists, there's a traditionally, and like I never did a journalism degree. I haven't done a cadetship, so I think traditionally journalists are taught to remove themselves from both the story and from the interviews, and there's kind of this invisible wall between the journalist and the voter and the politician. And I just never learned that. So when I'm having a conversation, like I talk about myself and, try and find points of commonality, and whether it's just geographical facts.
Almost gonzo in a way.
Yeah. And then there is example where the people talk about the pub test, and a lot of the people that talk about the pub test, you can't imagine them ever going to an actual pub.
Yeah.
But there is sometimes extremely good material that can be found by just walking into a pub and having a beer with someone, and as I said, not being there for 20 minutes, but actually like sitting down and having a session and picking people's brains, and they loosen up a bit. I think that's not that's not manipulative, as long as you're not doing it to try and fuck people over or make them sound like an idiot.
You're just not explicitly going in there for a 10-second soundbite and hoping to be in and out within 5 minutes.
Yeah.
Who are you going to vote for, mate?
Come on, tell me.
And people hate that as well. Like people hate
Hey, bloke drinking alone at the bar. Who are you going to vote for? Can you tell me? You're just talking about how the 24-hour news cycle does not really accommodate for this kind of long-form, nuanced writing, and in-depth interviews. There was a time in this election campaign, and a lot of people would prefer to forget, when the press pack went absolutely fucking feral with the gotcha questions. And we all know it was just about these young journos who really haven't been given opportunities that were afforded to their seniors and their mentors, and they're just trying to get a big name on Twitter. They're just trying to get their names out there. They're trying to get...
They're in the Canberra bubble.
They're in the Canberra bubble.
It's not real.
And it's the first time they're outside, so they will go to a town. They'll follow the Prime Minister to a town. They'll follow Morrison to a town like Bundaberg or like Singleton, and they won't ask about the town. They won't ask about the dog food factory down the road. They'll ask about some sort of stat that he should be briefed on, and they might even have inside word that he's not briefed on it, and they'll catch him out. And they were particularly fond of doing this to Albanese, and Albanese, they had him on the ropes for a while there. But you write in your essay, Victory, you wrote about a particular moment. If you just want to retell that story about, those big usos in the factory up there in South Brisbane.
Yeah, well, we're in a toll factory out near Logan, and I'd rocked up to I don't know how I got access, but I rocked up a day before, and so I was following around the bus, the Elbow bus, just in my Outlander, which was filled with clothes and sort of food wrappers and empty bottles, and so I rocked up on the
disposable vapes.
Yeah, disposable vapes. And I rocked up on the first day, and it was quite funny because I was hungover, and then it was extremely hot, and we were in the car park of this bowls club, and they were doing like a sort of staged media event, and someone offered what I thought was sunscreen, and so it was actually like the thickest zinc that you've ever seen, and so I chucked this sunscreen on, and my face just went completely white, and so I looked like this ghost wandering around the press conference, and all these journos were just looking at me like I was insane. Then that was the first day, but it was that same sort of feeling, like you just felt this animosity between some of the journalists and the politicians, the main one being Albanese, and then we went to an event after that, and Albanese got hammered, but he cut it really short. And then we went out to a toll factory the next day in Logan, and it was just so bizarre, because if you haven't been to one of these things, it's like the politicians just come out of nowhere for like a 45-minute event, but they're trying to make it look like they're part of the furniture and they really want to be there. And so all these camera crews are running around this factory, and there was all these Pacific Islander guys just standing over with their arms crossed with sort of like little shit-eating grins on their faces, because they had the morning off work because of this, but they were sort of like, what is going on here? And then there was a press conference, and it was just as some of the trans stuff was cutting through to the campaign, and Albanese was trying to talk about aged care. And he gave probably, I think that at that stage, the campaign was really bunkering down because the first debate was about to happen, and Albanese was on the ropes, and he was getting a lot of advice from senior Labor people about what do I do, how do I get this stature back, and I don't think he did it in one single event, and I think actually getting COVID probably helped as well. But yeah, he just came out, and it was the first time it seemed like he was maybe just talking off the cuff a bit and showing a bit of emotion, and he was talking about, you know, people in nursing homes who have soiled themselves and haven't got nurses coming to see them. And yeah, I thought it was a kind of really impassioned expression of what his campaign was trying to say to the electorate. And then there was just this air of impatience within the press pack. And then as soon as he finished, in came the questions about trans athletes. In came questions, just a series, like just kept questions.
Mr. Albanese, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 1,000. What is it?
Yeah, and so and he kept on trying to bring it back to the nursing homes, and it just wasn't working. But the distinction that I would make within the press pack is that it's not every single journalist in Canberra. It's not every single journalist. It's a certain kind of journalist, and generally, I think they're TV journalists, so that they're looking for footage and they're looking for kind of theatrics, and that can produce more pressure to kind of push for that sort of stuff. Whereas if you're a print journalist, you're looking for an answer that you can translate into good copy. So it's slightly different. Whereas if you're a TV journalist, you're trying to put pressure on the politicians, and I think that can be like a good thing, because I think politicians should be held to account. I think what was happening in the election campaign was that it was so tightly managed that there wasn't that much colour happening, and so journalists were really desperate to make that theatre happen, and they were just pushing for it more. And then the other thing that happened was that Albanese made a series of mistakes, and Albanese isn't a particularly macho guy. He's not Morrison was the sort of guy who would just finish a press conference, or he would just straight bat an answer, and he'd have complete confidence. And if you were watching and not really paying that much attention, you'd think that he was definitely right. Whereas Albanese's a little bit more vulnerable, and how he was dealing with it initially probably lent to that vulnerability. And then as the campaign went on, I think you saw this really concerted attempt where he started to basically take the press gallery on a little bit, and his confidence grew, and he was able to regain a semblance of confidence within his campaign, which I think did cut through to the electorate.
Yeah, we've been talking a lot about how these people all over Australia, all up and down Queensland that you went to, what their opinions were on politicians. We've been talking a bit about how journalists have been conducting themselves on the campaign trail. Did you speak to them about how they view the media themselves? I mean, like, obviously there's a lot of, you know, people aren't too sure on the media there. Like, they don't know what their kind of motives are when they're doing this.
I would say that was one of the main bipartisan issues travelling around. And there was, I did this like impromptu focus group up in Billawheeler with a range of different voters from different political backgrounds. Some of them were going to be first-time Labor voters. Some of them were diehard National voters who were going to keep voting for the LNP. And one of these farmers, this cattle farmer, it was really funny because the first thing that he was obsessed with was the fact that he'd heard a rumour that Anthony Albanese was going to make Bill Shorten the agricultural minister if he got elected. And so that was travelling all through central Queensland during the election campaign.
Oh, that is some good black ops.
Yeah, he'd been to a lunch during the week, I think, with Canavan and someone else. So I think that might have even come from high up. I don't know. When the media came up, he was extremely forceful about the fact that he hates gotcha questions, and he said he hates gotcha questions whether it's for Morrison or whether it's for Albanese. Like it doesn't show the kind of, you know, this is coming
any
from
nuance. Like, it just shows that there's no real understanding of what's at hand.
And it just makes it seem like a bit of a farce. Like,
well,
it makes
a circus. That's what it feels like.
And so you start to feel like that you haven't got, for voters like that who maybe don't, especially in regional areas, who don't have a lot of trust in politicians of any political kind, it sort of makes them feel like they can't trust the media. Well, then it just leads to this complete erosion of any trust within the democratic process.
It puts the journalist at the centre of the question, which is what it should never be.
Yeah, totally.
I want to talk. You weren't just in the bush. Some of the really interesting insights were coming from towns like Biloela. You know, Biloela, obviously the hometown of that young Sri Lankan family who, you know, have been in and out of detention centres and processing hotels for the best part of 10 years with those two young girls. They've eventually been allowed back. And Biloela would be an interesting insight into that old, I don't know how to describe it, but it was a very old Queensland kind of brothers in arms approach to getting that family back. And it was all political orders and all, you know, people of different backgrounds. You know, you had people that you describe as rednecks kind of marching the streets for this family to come home. You know, the old man worked in the abattoir. I mean, that story's in the past. Now the family were at home and safe. But that was actually a thorn in the side for the Morrison government, that kind of thing. And you've identified a few of them throughout the regions. You also did kind of talk to, you know, a new face of the Australian voter, which was obviously not urban, but suburban immigrant families, you know, maybe even English second language. One thing we did see in those election results was that these predominantly Chinese Australian suburbs, they effectively decided the election for some cities, definitely in some states. What were some of the kind of things you were seeing there, you know, particularly down the Chisholms and those kind of electorates?
Yeah, so Chisholm and Reid had pretty similar demographics, and they were held by the Liberals. It's not the top bracket in terms of affluence, but it's pretty well off, really highly educated, but very high multicultural population. And so massive Chinese populations, Chinese Australian populations.
So outer West Sydney, not necessarily.
Yeah, so
west.
just beyond the inner west.
Yeah.
So not far west, like the
real,
middle ring sort of suburb.
The real inner west, as people from Western Sydney would refer to it.
Yeah, and so I caught up with the voter named Stephen at the RSL out in Strathfield, and he was just a classic swing voter. And Chinese Australian voters, you can't really pigeonhole them, and you can't generalise them because they do, you know, they're not all swinging one way. But
No.
he was one commonality I think, if you were going to try and generalise, is that they're quite like highly informed about politics, so they're not oblivious to it, and they're very motivated by family. They're very motivated by economic security. And so a lot of them have been quite sympathetic to the Liberal Party. A lot of them came in under Fraser. And so they aren't rusted on for Labor. And I think what we saw over the last electoral cycle was that there was all different groups of voters that the Liberal Party just started to take for granted. And Chinese Australian voters was one of those groups.
Definitely.
And so when you saw all this kind of warmongering about China, and it was quite theatrical and really motivated by trying to create these wedge political issues to wedge Labor.
The Manchurian candidate.
Yeah, you just saw them really antagonise a group of voters who are quite sympathetic to their economic policies, and then that ended up hurting them. Like it ended up potentially costing them those seats, and then we saw. You know, it's not just those seats. The Chinese Australian population across the country is extremely large. And we saw both them lose seats like that, and we also saw a massive influx of multicultural candidates, especially from Labor, who, you know, Australian politics is playing catch-up with a lot of countries. Like, we like to think of ourselves as better than the US, and at the moment probably better than British politics, but they are far more multicultural on the conservative side as well.
Yeah.
And so you see, it was really interesting to see, like, over in the WA, which, but besides Queensland, is considered one of the most conservative states in the Federation. And you saw all these Labor candidates who came from really multicultural backgrounds, but they were also came from really, like, interesting stories. They weren't career politicians.
Dolphin trainer.
Yeah, the dolphin trainer, Mascarenas, who'd worked in mining for a long time and came from rural WA. Dad was a fitter and turner. And so I think that, you know, Australian politics still has a long way to go, but I think that that's another message for conservative politics, is that it is going to continue to really hurt them unless they become more diverse. It's not like a woke issue. Like a lot of multicultural communities aren't particularly woke.
No.
And so they can be quite naturally sympathetic to conservative politics, but not if you don't give them like a sense that they are going to be represented within our parliament.
Can you see a way forward for the LNP under Peter Dutton? Or do you think, all of us are Queenslanders in one way or another? And so he's our local boy. It's North Brisbane versus heavily gentrified Sydney.
Oh, look,
Do you think there's a little bit in Peter that could see him in with a chance next time?
I'm cynical about the idea that Peter Dutton is unelectable, which I think has been expressed quite a lot. Like I can understand why that idea is expressed, and because he is closely associated, especially with a lot of that warmongering about China, and he doesn't present particularly well to, your Teal voters who've switched from the Liberals. So
No.
it's going to be it's going to be tough. But I don't think that the unelectable term has been thrown around.
Oh, 100%.
It was used for Howard. It was used for Abbott. It was used for Morrison. Dutton is a different kettle of fish. Like, he doesn't even try to. He's not trying to do the blokey act. But
it was even used on Hawkey. That's the only reason why we got PJ Keating. Is because they were so terrified that Bob Hawke, of all people, was unelectable.
Yeah, I think that political events, depending on what happens, they could be beneficial to someone like Dutton, who is so.
He's polarising amongst especially people below the Tweed.
Yeah, I think that a lot of those Teal voters, a lot of voters in those seats, like the seats that Labor won in metropolitan areas, have been, held by the Liberals recently. So they're not rusted on Labor voters. Like, if economic conditions are bad enough, and if Labor doesn't run a tight ship, then people might just go back to one thing that you realise travelling around a lot is that people don't pay all that much attention to politics. And so Albanese, for example, there's so many people who said to me, I don't know anything about the guy. I don't think that, as alienating as Dutton's been in some circumstances, a lot of voters wouldn't know all that much about him. Like, they think that he looks funny, but that's like there's not deeply entrenched opinions, at least within lesser people who are paying less attention to politics. But that needs to be, for them, like, if you're looking at it from an LNP point of view or coalition point of view, that also needs to come with making visible changes to the way that they operate on a cultural level, in terms of pre-selecting people from more diverse backgrounds, in terms of pre-selecting more women.
That's the thing. Women aren't from a diverse background. Women are 50% of Australia. You know what I mean? That's to think that the Liberals couldn't even get that right, just the 50% mark. And that's why they lost all these seats. What I want to talk about is that Teal wave and that Greensland thing, that green bath and the Teal wave, or whatever they were saying. The idea that a recession could turn things around for Dutton if Labor don't pull together still doesn't really, in my mind, I don't think it wins back those seats. Those people voted Teal because they don't really like Peter Dutton, particularly New South Wales and Victoria. I don't know if those electorates are going to feel a recession pinch and flip, and Greensland as well. I don't think that they're coming back over a recession. They're not going back to Dutton. I feel like those are the more comfortable seats. They've made their call, and they're probably stubborn enough to stick with it for another term. What do you think happens there in these inner city seats that are actually no man's land for the major parties?
Yeah, I think that Dutton's got huge issues. Like, I don't want to downplay that. Like, it's going to be really hard. Like, he's got negatives, and he's dealing with a party that has just had a lot of brand damage. So he's got issues. And I think if we look at what has happened in terms of these voters who have been offered a different product that appeals directly to them, is that people are like, and this isn't a new phenomenon, people have been, over the long term, have been losing trust in the major political parties, and they are looking for people who appeal directly to them, whether that be with the Teals, whether that be with the Greens, and people voting for a party in outer suburban Brisbane in seats like, say, Ryan, which were rusted on for the Liberals, and it's not a Teal seat, and they voted for the Greens. Yeah. So people are looking for a different product, and the idea that the Liberal Party might win back government just by not having Scott Morrison there, that it's not that simple. But I think that if Labor, if Labor don't show, and they didn't last time, if they don't show restraint, because one thing that Albanese did by being so cautious, he not only was able to win back those seats from the Liberal Party in metropolitan areas with voters who are, economically doing quite well, but he also gave permission to voters in those Teal seats to vote for a Teal candidate, because they weren't so anxious about Labor coming in and wrecking the show. So it's a pretty delicate balancing act. Like, it's not.
I never thought of that.
Are the Teals here to stay? Like, are there going to be Teal candidates in 2, 3, 4 elections from now?
Oh, I think so. Like I don't see any lack of appetite both from the people who have gone into Parliament.
Well, if we solve the issue of global warming, if there's no more coal mines, if there's peace on Earth, why do the Teals need to exist?
Yeah, it's an ambitious program.
Why does Bob Katter need to exist? Like, between the Katters,
Because people like him.
Katter has the same appeal to the people of Kennedy as what the Teals have to their seats.
particularly Monique.
Authenticity, and it's just like the authenticity that you can't have if you're in a major party because you have to weigh up so many different sections of the electorate. And I think that we will see that continue to flower. Like the Teals have provided a template for these other seats where they did quite well and could potentially win if the major parties.
Coffs Harbour's next.
Yeah, there's still seats on the North Shore that could be won. Like, we're going to see Teal candidates at state elections down in Victoria. Like, that will be interesting. We're going to see the Greens running really hard down in Victoria. We potentially see Teal candidates running in those Brisbane seats that were lost to the Greens and offering them something maybe a bit closer to what is their natural inclinations. But it's that thing where, we, even in metropolitan Brisbane, you still had that sense of the siege mentality that Queenslanders feel. And the Greens offered them something that was quite local.
I want to talk about Queensland.
That was quite focused.
It was the most Queensland thing that Queensland could do at that election was fuck you both.
Yeah, the innate urge to just cause as much disruption as possible to the electorate. But
it was a different offering.
What were you seeing? What were you seeing on the ground before it happened? Did you see this happening?
It was a different offering from the previous election. Like, you didn't have the convoy going up, for example, and you don't want to keep on banging on about the convoy all the time. But
Bob Brown did fuck it in 2019.
2019,
Mate, Bob Brown certainly did fuck the Greens' chances up there.
He got the cat and put that in the microwave. I mean, that was just unfathomable.
But there's a lot of people in those metropolitan areas that found it distasteful as well, who might be like environmentally conscious.
Yeah.
And so what the Greens did was they offered a very bottom up kind of political movement to people, which felt local. Like, it didn't feel like it was being run out of Canberra. It didn't feel like it was being run out of Melbourne. Yeah. And that's like a lesson for both political parties. Like, it was very on the grounds. They'd been door knocking for years. It didn't seem when Ban said before the election they were going to win 3 seats in Brisbane, I was like,
they were laughing.
I thought they might win Griffith. I didn't see how they were going to win the Brisbane and Ryan. And then getting up there and mention them in the essay, and they're probably the stars of the essay in a lot of way, was Paul Hilton, who was an accountant from Toowoomba, whose family were trade unionists, and he switched to John Howard. He voted for Pauline Hanson in the Senate in '98, and he said that he fucking loved Johnny Howard.
Yeah.
And then he said, but I fucking hate Scott Morrison. And so I'm standing there going, I wonder where he's sitting now. Like maybe he's going to lean back to the family kind of origins. And I said, who are you thinking about voting for at the election? He said, mate, I'm going to fucking vote for the Greens.
Planet's fucked. My teeth are fucked. I'm voting for the Greens.
No,
he's an affluent voter. He's on a bunch of agricultural boards, so you'd think that he'd be nailed on for the LNP. But he's looking for something different. He feels like that the major parties are lying to him all the time. He does believe in climate change. He doesn't think that it's being acted upon. And he believes in free dental, he believes that people should have free dental care, and so stuff like that really cuts through. Where it feels like you're taking these abstract kind of political conversations and just saying things that can improve people's lives.
Free dental was a brainwave from the Greens in Queensland.
Well, how much of it do you think was the fact that southeast Queensland had an exceptionally wet summer, and there were lots of floods in the Lockyer Valley and in Brisbane, and this time it wasn't partly due to the fact that in terms of rivers, the Brisbane River is the middle child with ADHD. It's totally unpredictable. It's a river that just is born to flood. But as we said, all of these big seats in the middle of Brisbane, they went green. How much of that do you think is due to the fact that, the changing of the climate, this wounding of our environment was brought literally to their doorsteps?
Yeah, there's that. And there's just things are changing in terms of Australia's climate deadlock. It's really defined our politics from 2010. It had a big part to play in what happened with Rudd and the kind of instability that throughout the Gillard years, and then the instability since. Like it led to Turnbull's removal, and so I think that the public have like moved beyond the political parties, and so talking to voters who aren't environmentalists but who believe in renewable energy because they've seen it come in, like this is blue collar workers, because they've seen their workplaces fitted out with this stuff, their houses are fitted out with this stuff. It's not this kind of crazy woke thing that I think you sometimes still see the Liberal Party and the National Party, not like members of those parties can sometimes dumb it down to that, but like there's that voter Brad in Ipswich who's in a seat that previously had massive One Nation votes, and he was switching back. He'd voted for Morrison in 2019 because he didn't trust Labor. He thought that Labor was going to go into coalition with the Greens, and then he was going to switch back to Labor this time because Labor had probably done a more conscious attempt to differentiate themselves from the Greens. And he said to me, I think Labor's going to do more for the environment and they're going to treat Aboriginal people a bit better. And that if you walked into the Ipswich Jets Leagues Club and this guy's covered in tattoos and he grew up in Oakey, which is Ellen Jones's hometown, you would have a different perception of what he might say. But I got a sense that we're still defined by maybe the politics of John Howard, and Australian politics is still sort of defined by that lens, and it's sort of led to a paralysis in terms of like both social progress, but both in terms of being able to actually make the kind of large scale economic policies that can really improve people's lives. And then you have voters like, that's why it's this whole Southeast Queensland thing. It's not like a neat line. Like if Labor hadn't done those attempts to differentiate itself from the Greens, it might not have held on to the seats that they had in outer regional Brisbane, for example. But they also ended up losing Griffith to the Greens. So it's do
you think by Labor distancing themselves from the Greens, they gave themselves a shot in certain suburbs, but they also gave voters in the inner cities or in these Greensland seats permission to vote Green because they weren't with Labor?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, like if Labor had have been offering maybe a bit more strident embrace of climate change action, they might have won Brisbane. Yeah. They might have held on to Griffith. But in terms of putting together a majority, it might have been more difficult. Like it might have led to losses of seats in other areas, both in Queensland but elsewhere as well. And then you've got voters like, as I said before, Paul Hilton, who is a extremely affluent voter who's, prioritising things based on the environment. Then you had a voter like Dylan Rowe, who's a disability worker who was raised by a single mum, and he's voting for the Greens because it's going to improve both the lives of the people that he works with and his life and the life of his kid. And he can't see himself getting into the property market because he can't buy a house. And so I saw a new paradigm which hasn't fully presented itself yet. I think that is going to become a defining issue within politics. And the problem is that for a major party, it's impossible to keep everyone happy because you've got a whole swathe of voters who rely on the tax breaks that have led to Australia's property market being completely unsustainable and unavailable to younger Australians. And then you've got a generation of Australians who can't achieve the Australian dream. It's become a pyramid scheme. And so you're seeing those voters, I think, will be more and more attracted to minor parties and independents, and that's going to create chaos, I think, because millennials aren't a small generation. Like, it's a big generation of people, and if they don't feel like they're being represented, like we've talked about diversity, but
now they're having kids, so now they're really thinking.
And now they're turning into young boomers,
and so we've talked about diversity and gender politics, and economic politics is going to come into it. People are going to feel the pinch of this, and some of them will be fine, and then others will be trapped in this like eternal rental crisis.
And that line's only going to get wider.
Yeah.
But look, like under this current thing that we have with the property market, in order for this to be sustained, like everything else in capitalism, for every person that makes your life easier and better, someone has to eat shit.
Yeah, it's so difficult to see how politically anyone will do anything about it.
I just look at all the towers.
This pie.
I look at all the towers they've dragged down in Sydney and a fair few in Melbourne. They drag down these housing commission towers. They promise all of the residents in what is like legitimately social housing that there'll be a place for them when they rebuild. They rebuild a metro line. That's what's happening down in Redfern at the moment. They rebuild a metro line. And then they changed the terms of what social housing is to middle income housing, which are basically they're flogging off units. And they've changed the definitions of what public housing is. So then that's getting smaller and smaller. And people are moving to places that they're not from, and they're away from services. And the inner city's kind of being stacked. I mean, you just look at the lockout laws, and you look at King's Cross, you look at what's happening in some of those suburbs down in Melbourne near the water. What do you think? How does this blow? This pyramid scheme? What eventually happens? Do we just have a massive uptick in homelessness?
Well, it's just like intergenerational
Renting.
theft, and it's kind of, like this idea that if people just left the cities, they'll be sweet is like a complete furphy. Toowoomba's had a massive housing boom. Like other regional areas throughout New South Wales have had a massive housing boom. I know Alice Springs, it's extremely, like the rent's not that different. My sister lives up there. The rent's not that different to what I'm paying in Sydney if I want to go up and stay there. So the northern...
And you've got schoolrooms, you've got classrooms with 35 kids in the bush as well. You don't have that infrastructure. You've got base hospitals that were built in the 50s. Like, I don't know if decentralisation really is the answer right now.
You don't tend to earn as much in places like that as you can earn living in the inner city.
It's like you can move to Julia Creek, but you can work for Atlassian. I mean, like...
On the Skymaster.
That's great.
It was just, it was eye-opening because, like, I'd lived in Bundaberg previously, but I could notice the homelessness crisis up there was so much worse. And there was a voter that I spoke to who'd been kicked out of their place in northern New South Wales, and both her and her husband had jobs. She was working as an aged care nurse. He was working on farms. And they lost their house because the rent got jacked up by $250 overnight. And so they just travelled up and down the coast of Queensland, staying at caravan parks where they were paying $450 a week just to pitch a tent. And without a place, they couldn't get a job anywhere. And then they had 5 kids, 2 of whom had a disability. And so, that's an anecdotal thing. But there's a lot of stories like that. Like, this is not like a once-off sob story. Like, this is like historically, we think about Australian politics, we saw it as through the lens of class warfare in terms of the Liberals, which represented this kind of conglomerate of interests that were anti-trade union. And then I think that over time, and it hasn't quite happened yet, but there's going to be this kind of like generational warfare between people who bought when it was possible to buy, and then the people who didn't, or the people who bought and now can't afford to pay their mortgages because their wages are continuing to stagnate while their mortgages are going through the roof and rates are going to continue to go up.
Well, it goes back to what we were saying at the start about how Australians like to view ourselves as being, higher, in terms of a democracy, higher than America and Britain. But, you can't see this type of thing happening, in all parts of America because, every American politician has seen Taxi Driver. But they know that, if they continually try to mug off the public, they know that there could be a guy with a mohawk in the crowd who's going to put a 44 straight through their breadbasket. And the same can be said in England. I mean, it's so diverse over there that like you just cannot, be able to survive politically if you just ignore these massive issues.
The potential is that we head to just a more and more unequal society. And so, Australia's got a lot of historically has enormous issues on a range of fronts. But I think one of the things
when it comes to equality,
when it comes to equality, when it comes to the fact that we've never actually made any kind of like treaty with the First Nations people, and that's kind of like been there since white people arrived and colonised the place. So that's something that we need to address. But then on these economic issues, one of the things I think that we could be proud of was having like a welfare state. And so the idea of having that welfare state is completely undermined if people can't afford to buy a house, or let alone, afford to pay the rent. So that's why this is so complex, because there's all these fucking quite complex, both local and international issues feeding into this. And then you've got a political system that isn't supporting the diversity of needs and requirements. And then the major parties can't fit into that paradigm anymore because they're still kind of arranged along these lines that were created, back in the 1940s when Australian society was a lot less diverse. and a lot more straightforward. And you had
Yeah.
really the voting public divided up between those who were pro-union and those who weren't pro-union.
And there was only 1 million people on paper
Yeah.
in this country at
And, yeah.
the end of the Second World War.
And your priest told you who to vote for.
You spoke earlier about the Liberal Party kind of taking some parts of its base for granted and forgetting them, and that base or parts of that base leaving the Liberal Party. The same thing is happening with the Labor Party as well, it seems. Did you see, like, those stories you've just told about the people travelling up and down, pitching tents? They traditionally would feel like they're part of the Labor Party base, but people like that must be feeling pretty forgotten now as part of the Labor base.
And this is the 6 months of Albanese right now. Labor's in charge, so it's their opportunity to, and we'll wrap with this, but it's their opportunity to prove to those battlers that they are there for them. Are they taking them for granted?
You know, it's a long-running trend that Labor has been losing those voters, and they just like that's. If you look at how Labor won the election, it wasn't getting regional Queensland back. They didn't win any seats there. They got some decent swings in some of the seats. They got swings against them in Herbert up in Townsville. So it was winning these quite well-to-do metropolitan seats. So there'd be an argument to make that, you know, Labor needs to actually continue, like at least on an electoral basis, continue to appeal to this new kind of constituency that it's got, which is, new as in, it's been around since the 60s, 70s sort of onwards and gotten stronger and stronger and stronger. And that's university educated people, which is a lot, increasingly large section of the electorate.
The Keatingists.
So they can't, Labor can't, as much as it's romantic to think that Labor could just go back to this kind of romanticised working class party, they can't do that either. Like, they need to balance these sections of their voting base. Like, it's and it's extremely hard to do, and that's why political parties right around the world are finding it increasingly difficult to do that. And that's why we're seeing new things offered. And I would say that one of the reasons that we maybe didn't see a voting rebellion so much in those outer suburban or regional seats is because beyond the major parties, the offerings just like the Pauline Hanson and Clive Palmer have gotten to the point where I think that they're seen as part of the system. And so if you actually had like a genuinely populist party or independence or a system that was able to kind of circumnavigate the mainstream media, then you might see voters in those seats going there because they genuinely, even if they did vote for one major party over the other, it's not because they're satisfied with that offering. So there could potentially, could you imagine if there was this other kind of
this other force that could pick it up? But is that possible? Do you think that anyone has the chops to do that without descending into full-blown racism and anti-family courts rhetoric?
Or could it go the other way? Could we see in 10 to 15 years' times, if the equality lines keep dividing, that we see more hardcore kind of, say, socialists or more hectic, radical,
old North Queensland,
some more radical kind of.
It's going to be
up.
I think it's going to be mayhem.
It's probably a good thing that they took our guns away.
No, I don't mean mayhem as in civil dissent, civil disobedience or anything. I just think politically we're going to see. I don't think people have had their moment of catharsis and they're going to go back to the major parties at the next election. I think that it's provided a template, and I think people are going to be inspired right across the political spectrum. And it's
Katter's that what you're talking about, that archetype though, Katter has that at a state level. He has 3 seats at a state level. And we start talking about homelessness and someone who has the ability to, obviously cast a wider net in the electorate without the full-blown racism that we see from One Nation, or the anti-Semitic. I don't know what Clive's been into recently, but that does exist. Where do these votes go? I was very surprised Labor even got the Hunter.
Yeah, well, you get someone like Repicoli who very much played up into his past as a blue-collar worker. He has a bit of local prestige because he's a Olympic Commonwealth Games shooter, and very much tapped into the kind of larrikin
big unit.
Yeah, the Aussie larrikin archetype that I've written about before. And as I said before, Labor can't just run Dan Repicoli's in every seat in Australia, and he said that himself. He was saying that people up here in the Hunter want to see people like me, and in different seats they want to see people who actually reflect them. And so he's there's been some great photos of him and Sally Shittu, where that's kind of the model.
He's 3-4 foot taller than her. Yeah,
that's kind of the model for both political parties, is to create this sense that you are creating a rich tapestry that actually reflects the diversity and richness of modern Australia. And if they don't, well, then it's kind of going to continue to be carnage.
Just lastly, Lech, thank you for joining us. You've provided, as always, some great insights. Where do you see Morrison in the next 5-10 years?
Morrison.
Do you reckon he hits that televangelical speaking circuit?
I think Hillsong might have a vacancy pretty soon at the top. So, well, they already do, don't they? Houston's
They do,
gone.
yeah. But
so-
that organisation is a bit on the nose.
Yeah, he might need to start
moment.
his own.
Well, he already
Yeah.
distanced himself from them for his own political aspirations.
No, see, he's part of the Horizon Church.
Yeah,
He tried to get a gig on the NRL, but unfortunately
Mate, that was like Howard and the ICC. It's like all those years of his anti-Indian comments and rhetoric. It's like John Howard would like to run for ICC chair, and the Indians were like, absolutely fucking not.
Well, and that was
Veto.
the NRL were the same with Morrison. They're like, you could fuck up a cup of coffee, mate. There's no way.
The problem with that wasn't even the Labor thing. It was that, as far as I know, Perrottet hates him, doesn't he? So, and the New South Wales government is providing all this money in various different ways. So, if you've alienated Liberals and then you've also alienated all these Labor state governments who all pay the NRL a fair bit of money for state of origins and test matches and Magic Round and all that sort of thing. That's not who you're sending in. No, not at all.
No.
I reckon he'll end up on the Christian speaking circuit where he'll get paid very handsomely. But I can't see. Can you see him finishing a term here?
Well, I think
His ego is very bruised at the moment up there on the backbench.
I think he might be there for the rest of the term. Yeah.
I could see him as being the Australian ambassador to Ireland or something. Or
Going back where it all began.
or
somewhere
the
religious.
Holy See.
Yeah, maybe somewhere like Poland.
Israel.
But like, I just don't think he has the discipline, like in his personality, really, to be into Roman Catholicism.
Or
I mean, he has no conscience. I mean, that's one of the pillars of Roman Catholicism, is this internal motor that tells you that you've done something wrong all the time.
Imagine getting banged up abroad and you're fucking in a jail cell looking at 20 years in prison, wrongly accused, and you find out that that's your ambassador.
Hello, brother.
See the footy last night?
Mate, the Sharkies, mate. You think they're fucked? You're fucked, mate.
That's it. Thanks for joining us, Lech. We'll be getting you back in here when the new book's done. We won't talk about that today. We'll wait until you finish it. All the best. Happy writing.
Thanks, guys. Pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Lech.